So today, we'll be discussing different ways to recruit volunteers using the CERVIS platform. And we'll also take a look at evaluating your recruitment, how you have opportunities posted, and how to check in and make sure that things are running efficiently. So of course, every organization is a little bit different, but there are times where this type of interaction will be accomplished by sending direct links to volunteers or posting QR codes on flyers for volunteers to scan. But the vast majority of times that you are engaging with volunteers, that's probably going to take some kind of form factor through your website or through a standalone event listing page where you are posting opportunities for volunteers to engage with. So let's take a look at a couple examples and different ways that you can recruit volunteers through CERVIS using some of the existing tools. What we're looking at right now is an example where I have embedded an iFrame in our website that is the event listing page. Now you do have a standalone version of this page as well, and you can point people to that page, no problem. But typically I recommend and prefer to send people to an embedded version of that page so that you have a little bit more cohesion. You're keeping people on your website. You're directing them to something that you are familiar with, that they're probably familiar with. It's on your website as opposed to a standalone page. Either way, the form factor is kind of the same. And the way that volunteers engage with this is very similar. So let's take a look at a couple examples of types of opportunities and how you might post events for registrations. The simplest way to accomplish this in CERVIS is probably what you're most familiar with, and it's what most people do as they're engaging the platform, and that would just be posting opportunities for direct registration. As an example, I have this orientation posted here. You can see it's on Sunday, January 25th from 6 to 8 p.m. There's 9 spots available. If someone clicks on this event, they can read more about it, and then from there, they can sign up as a volunteer. This event doesn't have any restrictions in place. It's basically just posted publicly, and it's available for direct registrations. This is probably the most common way that you might recruit volunteers through CERVIS is just by posting a shift. In this case, this is a normal event, but this might also be a time slot event where you've posted multiple different positions and then a volunteer picks, what day or time works best for them. All in all, when a volunteer is interested in this, they can click to sign up for a position. They'll ultimately either log into an existing account, or if they're new, when they plug in their info here, the system will recognize that this is a new account and they need to make a new profile. So they'll create a profile first and then complete their registration. But either way, once the volunteer completes their registration, they'll get a confirmation message. They'll see a confirmation message on this screen. They'll get a confirmation email, and then they can move on. Typically at this point, a volunteer might be done with their interaction. They've registered for the event that they were here to sign up for. They might want to sign up for something else, and they can do that through here. They might want to sign up a family member for the exact same shift. They can do that as well. But generally speaking, once a volunteer signs up for something, it's kind of what they were targeting. They might just close out of the browser and move on. So that's kind of the standard interaction in terms of volunteers signing up for positions. Now, there's a lot of ways to vary that. For example, you might have restrictions in place. You might have an event where volunteers have to be over a certain age range, or they might have to have completed a certain training in order to sign up for that event. And that will still look the same on this page in terms of how volunteers interact with it. You just maybe want to communicate a little bit differently. As a volunteer is signing up for an event that has those kinds of restrictions in place, maybe you want to have tags with stickers attached to them that kind of indicate, hey, there's an approval process here, or you have to have had a background check completed or some kind of training completed. We'll talk about adding these stickers more in a minute. This can really help with kind of clarifying what volunteers are looking at. But ultimately, the registration process from the volunteer's perspective is very similar. They can click to learn more about that opportunity, click to register, and then as long as they meet the requirements, they'll see a confirmation message. If they don't, they'll see a failure message. You can actually tune that failure message as well, and we'll look at that more in a moment as well. So that's kind of, again, just a slight variation on that direct registration process. But I want to point out a couple other unique use cases that you might not have been aware of or might not have utilized before. One that maybe you have is kind of an application approval process. And actually the opportunity I just pointed out here, kind of that swim team coach position, has that application approval process. I also have that in place for like this office work position or reading mentors. And I've added a sticker to indicate that here, that there's approval required. But these are all service projects. And the default stance in the system for a service project is that when a volunteer is interested in this, they apply to participate, and then that puts that person on your radar. Now, in this case, once they've been approved, I do actually want them to record hours in here. This is ultimately where they are housing their hours in the system. So if someone applies to be a part of this office work project, on the back end, I can be notified when they applied, and then they get put into this kind of inbox under opportunity management. And then I can see who applied, when they applied, what they applied for. So again, that office work project here. I can see any notes on their application, or if I had custom registration questions in place, like for this Reading Mentors project, I can go and verify that information here. And then use that as a part of the process for evaluating this volunteer before approving or rejecting them. And so again, this is kind of a standard workflow in the system, although it might not necessarily be one you're using all the time. It's not a direct registration. There's kind of a stopgap in place. I want to point out, when you're creating service projects, that is the standard workflow. There's a setting when you create a service project that says automatically approve service project applications. This is set to no by default. So when someone is interested in a project, they apply for it, they get put in that inbox, and then you have to approve or reject them. If you want to, you can forego that application approval process by having people automatically approved. One other thing to note about this kind of application approval or kind of like pending registrations is you can do the same sort of thing with events. Now, normally, a normal event and a time slot event have a direct registration process. A volunteer registers, they get signed up immediately, they get the confirmation message, kind of like what we looked at earlier. But with both normal and time slot events, you can enable kind of like a stopgap. So under the advanced options, you can see there's a setting that says require approval of volunteer self-registration. If this is enabled, then it requires volunteers to be approved before they are actually registered for this specific shift. So it's very, very similar to the application approval process that service projects have by default. The difference being a little bit of the language, and you can see there's a different bucket that these land in. So on the main dashboard, this says review pending event registration requests. If you're looking in your console and you don't see this or review open service project applications, that means you don't have any to review. So you would need to set up an event that utilizes it and have someone apply before this button actually shows up. But if we click in here, I can see who's applied for this event. I can see when, I can see notes. If I had custom registration questions, I could see that as well. And again, through here, I can approve or reject people or delete these requests if I need to. So this is that idea of some kind of stopgap. People apply for a project or apply for an opportunity, and then I have to go through and approve or reject those applications. One other thing I want to point out in regards to that is that you can still use restrictions in those scenarios. So maybe I don't want anyone under 18 applying to be in my office work project, right? So I could still have on this project, if I go in to update it, I could still have application restrictions that say volunteers must already be 18 in order to apply for this project. So you can still have restrictions like that, whether it's background checks or age or custom fields or checklist items or groups or anything like that. So this is functionally the same as setting restrictions on your events. There's one other interesting use case for service projects in particular as it pertains to recruiting volunteers. And that would be the idea of using a service project as essentially an application bucket. So I don't want necessarily volunteers to record hours into this project I've created here called Apply to Work in Youth Services. This is a program that I'm looking for new volunteers for, but there's kind of a process in place. If someone's interested in working in youth services, I do want to know that, and I have some extra questions I want to ask them, and they still have to meet some parameters, but I want them to apply first here, and then I'll engage their profile. I might run a background check. I might then go and have them go and attend a certain training. I might have some kind of like reference check in place. And then once I've done those things, then I might mark something on their profile saying they're approved for working in youth services, which would give them permission to register for other opportunities in youth services. So this is kind of another use case for service projects in particular, where I am not at all anticipating recording activity into this service project. I'm purely using it to gather interest from volunteers and have them apply initially. So as far as like recruiting volunteers, that's the sole purpose of this project in this context. I do not expect any hours to ever appear in this project. In fact, I have it set up so that volunteers can't record hours, and I may not ever actually register anyone for this project. I'm purely using it to receive applications. So very, very similar in concept in terms of someone applying for one of my other projects. But when someone clicks into this, they can read more about the program and kind of what this process looks like. And then when they click apply, again, it's going to put them on my radar. On the back end, I can see who has applied. If I go into review open service project applications, I can see when someone applied, who it is, what they applied for. And then on the right-hand side, I have some custom registration questions I want them to answer before they can, be approved or rejected. So some of the back and forth gets cut out. I don't necessarily have to email this person right away and ask them those questions. They've already answered them. So this just kind of helps cut down on some of that back and forth for onboarding or for recruiting. But basically, I'm just using this service project to make sure that this person is placed correctly. They're interested in youth services. They've applied for that. And then once I've gone through and either run background checks or had them attend a certain training, then I might go into this person's profile, update their account, mark that the background check was completed, or mark off something on their profile. Like in my system, I have a question saying that this person is permitted to work with, in childcare events. So I might mark yes in that, or maybe I'm using a checklist item for that kind of info. But I'm basically just using this service project to gauge interest and display the different types of projects that we have available without anticipating hours being recorded into this. Ultimately, the volunteer who gets kind of approved through here, I'm not necessarily clicking approve, I'm actually just updating their account. But then that gives them permission to register for other opportunities that require that they've already been approved. So that might sound like a distinction without a difference from the other projects, but the idea here is that this is just a container. People are applying for this program and that gets them on my radar. Maybe I place them under the correct person's kind of purview and say that, this person's in charge of that individual. And once we've done all the checks, then they can move on from there. But the idea is that I'm advertising a program that may or may not have other events at the moment, but I'm still capturing people who are interested in that and they're specifically applying for that so that they get on my radar in the correct way, and I can ask them event or kind of application specific questions related to that program. So a couple kind of important things that I threw out very quickly, I want to make sure you're aware of. In this context, I am using these custom registration questions to make sure that people can kind of answer the questions that are related to that program. So if we go and look at that, apply to work in youth services, if I click on manage custom registration questions, I have a few questions related here that I don't have pop up necessarily everywhere else. One of these specifically has to do with youth services, so I wouldn't have this question asked anywhere else. It's not on my general application, but when someone's interested in working with youth services, I'd like them to answer this. So you could have any number of questions like that that are kind of tied into these types of buckets or application projects. And that's kind of one of the benefits of using these in that manner. Okay, there's one last format for recruiting volunteers that I wanted to mention in terms of setting up opportunities. And then we'll get into some ways that you can kind of simplify what your volunteers are engaging with by providing them ways to visually distinguish things, or maybe run searches, or maybe have you direct them differently to your opportunities. So that last kind of format I wanted to mention is hidden events. You might have a use case where you have an event or a project that has sensitive information attached to it, or perhaps it's only designed for a certain set of people. In that scenario, you might not want your event publicly posted. So what we can do is when we create an opportunity like that, just make sure that the publish online status is set to no instead of yes open, which is normally what you might do. And then from here, you can grab a private registration code link. We can see that link here, but we can also see it if we back up. So this is on the main page for that event. There's an option down here to grab a private registration code link. We can click on that. There's two versions of the link, but they both do the exact same thing. And then there's also this private registration code invitation email. This is just a prefab email that contains instructions on how to register and all the details about this event. So if you know you will just want to recruit a certain person, or maybe send this to a certain contact, you can go and look that person up and email them this email. You can make changes to it if you want to, but it's kind of got all the data in there that it needs to, including that private invite link. And what that link does is it sends someone directly to that particular event, even if it's not posted online publicly. So again, the use cases here, if you have an event that has private information associated with it that you do not want displayed publicly, then this can be useful. Alternatively, perhaps you already know who you want to recruit for that event, but they don't have profiles, or maybe you want to send it to a certain group or a certain contact and have them sign up without posting it for anyone else to see. Okay, so a couple things to point out as we're talking about recruiting volunteers that can help make it a little bit more successful. And that would be some of the things that I've already sort of mentioned: stickers, so adding these icons to your opportunities, and then also just the verbiage within the events themselves. How are we communicating about the events? How are we posting information? Are we adding images into these things to provide a little bit more flavor? And then also, how do we use interest categories to sort these opportunities? Now in CERVIS, there's a number of ways that you can kind of filter and sort your opportunities, whether it's things like programs or locations, interests, volunteer type, or like these tags, which are really pretty flexible. You can use these for a wide variety of things. So there's a lot of ways that you can do sorting on your end. You just want to make sure that you're being consistent with that. If we back up to the admin console here, if you've never looked at it before, it'd be a wise idea to at least check in under attribute management with your interest category inventory management. This is essentially a folder system that it defines where all your events go. Now you can see in my demonstration console, I'm using sort of two sets of interest categories. I have a list of programs or departments, and then I have a list of sites or locations. If you are a multi-site organization, this kind of structure makes a lot of sense. For the vast majority of our customers, that's not necessarily going to be the truth. So it usually makes sense to pick one kind of idea that helps you sort your events. Again, I think of these like folders. So if we're talking about something like programs or departments, you can see here I have a list of these kind of titles of different things that I'm committing to. And these are what my events fit into. So I, again, kind of think of them like folders. When you make an event, it goes into one of these categories, and then you can use these as a basis for searching or for reporting or for filtering. If we look back at where I have my events posted, I have some example home pages here based on location or based on program. This is using my interest categories. If we click into this and I say, hey, show me all the events in community outreach by clicking on that button, then that will filter by that interest category. Now I want to be very clear. The buttons on the right-hand side here that we're looking at, These home pages that we looked at, like this example, these are just a website. They don't necessarily have anything specifically to do with service, apart from the fact that obviously they are on our website at the moment. This is just an example. You can really do kind of whatever you'd like to in this kind of realm. But the idea is I am having my volunteers, go to a landing page like this, and they say, yeah, I want to see community outreach events. They click on this button, and then that takes them to a filtered version of the event listing page. So within Service now, we're talking about your event listing page, and you can see it says search filter applied. If we want to click into that, we can actually see it's filtering by community outreach, as we might assume, because that's the button that I had clicked on. Now, this is using interest categories, but there are a number of other ways that you can do this. You can create filters using keywords, using dates, using zip codes, using tags. So I have a few other examples here. Like I've created a tag in my system for family-friendly events. You can actually see that icon here. It's a sticker that's posted for volunteers, so they could just click on that if they want to. But I've also made a button that will show only the family-friendly events, right? You can also create zip code filters. So if you want to show people all the events that are occurring within a radius of a certain zip code, that pulls up this map that people can engage with as well. They can zoom in and click on events and go to them from there, right? So there's different ways to kind of point people to this event listing page and filter by things like your interest categories or your tags or keywords or all that sort of stuff. If you'd like to dive into this subject more directly in your console, kind of think through what would be best, please reach out to us. We offer a complimentary web integration meeting where we could go through this process with you, setting up some kind of homepage or some kind of filter process that makes sense for you to help you kind of tune that into what you're doing. But any of that stuff that you're tracking about your events that I mentioned, like location or interest category or tag, those can be used to create those sorts of filters. So again, your interest categories are an important layer of that. How are we categorizing events? Does that make sense? If you go in and you look at your interest categories and you don't have anything in here, well, you might consider building out some categories that represent the different programs that you offer, the different types of outreach you're doing. That way you can identify that when you're creating events and then use that to run reports or to create those filters. But another way you can do that is with tags and with stickers. So I've used those terms a couple times now. Tags are an identifier on the back end. If we go into an event, if I click into any of my events here, I can add tags up at the top. So I can click on an opportunity here and say, this is an important event, right? I can tag that. I'm making a new tag at this case. I don't already have a tag in the system that's called important. But this is only visible on the back end. My volunteers can't see this. Something I can search by, I can click on that tag and show me all the events that are tagged important. If I want that to be visible to my volunteers though, then I would need to create a sticker that's attached to it. The way you do that is after you've made the tag. So I have the tag important, great. Now what I need to do is go into the tag cloud. There are a lot of different ways to get here. You can see this button on every single event, but we can also see it when we're in searching volunteers, searching opportunities up at the top. You can see it says view tag cloud. It's actually also in this profile icon here, view tag cloud. So there's a bunch of different ways to get here, and they're all kind of the same. Once I click on that view tag cloud, it'll show me all the tags in the system. So we could go and find that new one we just created, important. And then you can see to the left of it, it says apply tag sticker. You will only see this option to apply a tag sticker for opportunity tags. This is a distinct set of tags as compared to tagging your volunteers. So if we look down here, we see this important opportunity tag that I created. I can click on apply tag sticker. I can give it a friendly name. So this is what gets actually displayed to volunteers. So we'll say this is an important event. Then we can go and pick what icon we want to use. So there's a lot of different options in here. If you have any thoughts or questions about, hey, is it possible to get this sort of icon? Let us know. We tend to add these pretty regularly, but there are a whole slew of different options in here already. So you go and pick what icon you want to use. And then you can pick how that sticker is being displayed. Do we want this publicly visible? Is it only on the back end? So again, not shared with volunteers. Or do we want this to be searchable as well? Typically, I make things searchable unless it's something that's kind of more of an attribute about the event. I can show you an example of that in a second here. So if we apply this sticker, you can see that that's now attached to the tag. And if we back up and we're looking at this event now, we can see that icon here. So now any event that has that tag has that icon showing up. Now, what you use these stickers for is entirely up to you. I typically like to have like accessibility features used or relayed through these tags or through these stickers. So for example, I have this wheelchair accessible icon. I have this like multilingual or translation kind of icon. You have different things like that, or maybe you want to identify this as a heavy lifting event, or this is good for families, or good for kids, or good for groups, or good for court-ordered volunteers, right? So some kind of thing like that would help people clue in on what they are looking for based on maybe what their needs are, or perhaps what they're interested in, right? I've also identified some events that have to do with water, or with different kind of ideas like being outside or being inside, or sports or whatever else, right? So depending on like what types of opportunities you have, you might use very different icons here, and they might mean very different things. But the point of this is that we can kind of get people used to looking for iconography. People are kind of drawn to this to begin with. If they see a screen full of text, they're not necessarily going to read everything. But if you pop some icons in there that people can get accustomed to looking for, like, oh, I like the family-friendly events. They can see that icon. They can click on it and they can sort by it if they want to, but they can also just see it. So they can glance through your events and identify the ones that they're interested in based on the icons that you've provided. So there are a lot of different ways to use this. If you have questions about that, obviously reach out to us. But that can be a very helpful way to distinguish your opportunities and provide some ways for volunteers to kind of simplify their decision-making process. So one last component of this, I just want to point out, I already sort of mentioned it. It's important that your events have description sections that kind of lay out what volunteers need to know about the event. Now, this example right here, actually, I would probably recommend editing. I might have some other kind of formatting in here to define different sections, like what do you need to know? What do you need to bring? What do you need to wear? I would recommend creating sort of a template for yourself that you can use on all of your events so people get accustomed to looking for, the data that they need in the same place on your opportunities. So one thing I want to point out in that world of creating templates is you can obviously duplicate events in CERVIS. If you weren't aware of that, you should be. If we click on an opportunity, we can just duplicate an event and then work from that copy. But I also wanted to point out, when you are creating events or editing a description section, you can utilize this tool to save or load field content. So what you could do is make yourself a template. So we might have like a section that says, what do you need to bring, right? And then I might make this bold and maybe increase the font size of that. And then I might have another section that says, what do you need to wear, right? And then I might have a couple different sections like this. And I have, text underneath that defines obviously what we're talking about here. And then I could save this as a template. So I could give myself like a description template. And then whenever I want to create an event that uses that same form factor, I can just go in here and say load field content, pick from the list, load that in, and then adjust the text as needed. Okay, that's getting a little bit in the nitty gritty, but that is kind of an important part of recruiting volunteers, is communicating clearly, making sure that volunteers know what the expectations are. What should they expect at that event? Are they going to be standing, sitting? Is it indoors, outdoors? Is it cold? Is it warm? Is it with people? Is it alone? That kind of information is important. And one of the strongest ways to convey that data is actually via icons or pictures. So I think it's an important aspect too, that you consider adding images to your events of the work being done in situ, because then people can kind of see what to expect. You get a lot of information looking at an image like this. Oh, I'm inside, I'm with people. I might be lifting heavy boxes. Looks like everybody's standing, right? There's a lot of information conveyed in an image like this. Okay, A couple other things I want to point out about kind of recruiting, promoting, sharing opportunities. We talked about the direct invite link, this private invite link as well. But I want to talk about one other thing that you can do with invites like that, or kind of with promoting your opportunities. You might consider doing something like creating a poster or a flyer, posting it on a nearby campus or at a nearby workplace that often sends volunteers to you. You also might consider posting like a Facebook ad for a certain type of opportunity you're trying to garner more recruitments for. And if you're doing that, you might want to know how successful that campaign was. And a way that you can do that is via something called source tracking. So source tracking in Service is the idea that I know how someone landed on my event listing page if they signed up for that event. What you can do is you can add a source to any link that you send to anyone. So maybe I'm creating a poster for a certain campus. I could create a link that it could be to an embedded page, could be to a standalone page that actually tracks a source. So I can identify, like I just wrote poster campus. Obviously I'd probably want to be a little bit more pedantic here about like which campus it is. But I could create my own source that I know what this is and how people might have gotten this link. And then I could take that link and I could just obviously post it into like, a document or something that I'm printing out. If I'm making a poster, I probably want to make a QR code so that people can scan that. So I could copy that link and I can actually paste it into the search bar on the main dashboard and generate a QR code using that. But now if someone scans this QR code and then they actually go and sign up for an event after scanning this QR code, the system will know that that was because of the poster. And you could run a report that will tell you how many people signed up because of that poster at CSU, or whatever the source tracked link that you might have used is. Again, that could be like an ad online on Facebook or something. Could be a poster, could be a flyer. But the idea is that you are creating special links so that you can identify how successful was this campaign. Another use case I've heard of for that would be maybe you have people who are actively recruiting and you just want them to be able to track like how many people signed up from their campaign. You might have a student who wants to bring volunteers from their school. So you could give them their own special link that they share, maybe give them a QR code, help them create flyers or have them do that themselves. And they post it up and they just want to know how many people were recruited via that. You could create a source tracked link that is that student's name or some kind of identifier that you could then run reports on, because you can actually see in certain reports, how did people sign up? So let me talk about those reports real quick. If you have questions about creating source tracked links and the technical aspect of that, please submit a ticket. But it's really pretty straightforward. In most cases, it's as simple as adding ampersand source equals to the end of a URL and then sending that out or making a QR code. I should say ampersand source equals and then whatever the name of the source is you want to use, right? In my example, I did poster_CSU. Okay, but when we're looking at our opportunities, there's a few reports that pull that source information. So I want to point those out real quick. If we go into kind of the opportunity management side, I can select multiple events here. And if I print out the summary for these events, so there's the summary report, PDF or Word document, both of these will allow me to see the different sources that people used when registering. So you can see there's a byline here for registration source. I have admin, direct, walk-in. These are the three default sources that you will always see. Admin is kind of exactly what you might expect. Someone on staff signed up 42 of these people. Direct is a volunteer just logged in themselves or they registered for the event themselves, but they did not do that through a source tracked link. So this was done either directly on your website or through some other means. You might have sent out a link previously that didn't have a source on it. That's just what a direct registration is. And then walk-in is also what it sounds like. They used the sign-in console and they did a walk-in registration for that event. So you can kind of identify the different registration sources here. If you have created any source tracked links and those have been used, then you will see those sources show up in here as well. So that link that I just created for poster_CSU, if anybody used that, it would say poster_CSU, and it would identify the number of people who registered using that particular link. So this is one report that kind of conglomerates that data, but you can also choose to view that information directly in line with registrations. If we go into report management under the volunteer management heading, there are a couple reports in here that allow you to pull a lot of information. The first one is kind of the one I want to focus on here, this custom participation report. One of the items that you can choose to include in this report is the registration source. So it's a high detail piece of information because it's attached to each registration. But we can grab that registration source, that will add that as a column to this report, and then we can see how people all signed up for this event. Okay, so again, that can be kind of a really helpful tool in identifying how well your recruiting is doing, at least internally, right? You're tracking that information. You're capturing, how did people find this? How did people sign up? How many people actually followed through using that source tracked link? One other component of that I want to mention, there is a setting in the system configuration under system settings it's under system settings that allows you to automatically tag volunteers created via source tracked links. So again, going back to my example, if we have this set to yes, and I had that poster with that QR code that I made before, if someone scanned that QR code and then they signed up for an event and made a new profile in the process, they're a new volunteer, then it would automatically tag their profile as poster_CSU. This is a volunteer tag, so it would show up in the volunteer database. Again, if we looked at the tag cloud, it would be one of these tags. So in the past, I've done this with this Matt Meyer recruit. So we could see like all the people who signed up using that, his tag basically, right? So we could see all the new accounts that were created using that particular tag. Okay, but again, this is a little bit more internal. It's more kind of you tracking that information, not necessarily reaching out to volunteers and evaluating. I think an important thing to do, at least every once in a while, is to track a prospective volunteer, asking how their experience of the process signing up went, maybe asking if they had any questions, asking if they were confused at all during the process, perhaps sending out a wider survey to your volunteer base, or using some of the interior tools in Service to track some of that information. Now, I want to say this with a caveat. There's always going to be squeaky wheels, and that's good. We want to try to gather information from those people as we can. But you just want to make sure you're gathering info from a larger group and kind of evaluating the feedback in that context. Now, in Service, there's a couple built-in tools that you can use to track some of this sort of survey information or just ask questions of people as they're registering. One is through the sign-in console. You can ask kind of a questionnaire when someone is using the sign-in console. So if we open this up real quick in sign-in mode and I just go to sign in here, you can see I have a questionnaire that asks, did you have any questions during your registration process? Yes or no. And someone has to answer this, yes or no. And then I can also ask, what can we help you with, right? You could ask whatever questions you want to through here. You can have up to 3 questions presented. These are asked once per day. I wouldn't leave questions like this on all the time necessarily, unless they're optional. But every once in a while, you might want to turn these questions on and ask your volunteers who are signing up during a certain period, how did it go? And then you can run reports and searches to find if there's anybody you want to check in on, and see if there's any improvements that could be made to the process. These questions are established in the system configuration. So if you are using the sign-in console, this can be a really helpful tool. If we go into Edit System Configuration, and then we go into the sign-in console or kiosk options, in here you have sign-in console custom question 1, 2, and 3. So you can define what type of question this is, whether or not it's being used, and then make it optional or required. If it's a selection box, like my yes/no question here, you need to provide the answers. Obviously, I don't have a required answer in this case because they can tell me whatever they want to. But you can kind of ask those informational questions here. When someone answers these questions, they get tied to their registration for that particular shift, whatever it might have been. and you can, run reports on that data and run searches by that information. So you can go in and run reports that will pull all that data together and then, go look for kind of the squeaky wheels and try to find if there's anything that you can glean from your interactions and, ask for more information or follow-ups, things like that. Another tool that allows you to kind of do that directly within Service is actually impact tracking. Now, this is kind of a broader subject, and we do have a separate webinar on this, but impact tracking allows you to record, like what happened during a shift. What did people actually do? But you can also use this as like a sort of crude survey tool, right? I have this question here, rate your shift experience 1 to 10. And this is actually a part of the sign-in console too. It can be, or you can have people log in after the fact and fill in this information. But in my case, I have people when they're signing out from certain events, I have this impact tracking turned on, and then they're, going to give me a number, and I can run reports on this. And again, I'm looking for kind of like the highs or the lows. If I want to get some information or some different quotes from people or things like that, I can kind of identify that info using this type of information here. Okay, so a lot of information we've just kind of gone through. Like I said, several of those things kind of have their own webinars in terms of how to utilize those tools, custom registration questions, impact tracking, the sign-in console. If you have further questions about any of those things, please let us know. Also, as I mentioned before with like web integration, if you have questions about your particular implementation, we would be happy to meet with you further and kind of one-on-one go through this in your console and what's best practices for you, what might serve you best. But I do think it's a good idea to kind of do some of this evaluation of where things are at, how are we recruiting people, do we need to set up different types of opportunities to serve essentially as recruiting pipelines and letting people explore what they're interested in, publishing maybe multiple of this type of thing. Or are we just having people directly register? That really depends on your onboarding and what your process looks like. But if you do have further questions about that concept or any of those things that we discussed today, of course, do not hesitate to reach out to our customer support team. You can always use this Need Help tool at the bottom of the page to submit a ticket to our support. Click on Need Help. You can type in a topic here. Again, maybe you want to learn about custom registration questions. You could search by that term, see articles that have to do with that. But you can always click on Contact Us at the bottom and submit a ticket to our support team through here. And then again, I want to point out, if you do want to look up some other material, we do have a lot of webinars and previously recorded material on our YouTube channel. If you go to video.servicetech.com, there's a lot of good information in there as well. All right, well, I know there's a lot of information today. Again, if you do have further questions, especially as it relates to that web integration, please don't hesitate to reach out. But we're grateful for the time that we got to spend with you today directly. I know I've met with a lot of you, so thank you for joining. As you do have more questions and as you're kind of working on streamlining your volunteer onboarding process, please connect up with us. We'd be happy to help you with that. So thank you for your time today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.